A historic peace deal has shaken up alliances in the Gulf, the Middle East, and the rest of the world. But what does this new warmth between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel mean for business? I'm Samir Hashmi in Dubai, and this is Talking Business. A historic deal that could be worth billions of dollars in terms of new trade and business. The so-called Abraham Accords, signed between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel, has certainly injected new impetus in these economies as they start 2021. In a moment, we'll look at what does this deal mean for them, the region, and I'll be discussing that with my guests who have joined me here today. We have Mr. Thani Al-Shirawi, who's the founding member of the UAE-Israel Business Council, and he's also one of the leaders of the Al-Shirawi Group, which covers 30 companies across various sectors. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I have Edidayo Bolaji Adio. She's from the Economist Intelligence Unit, and she'll be talking in detail about the region, about what does this deal mean. Thanks a lot for joining us. And William Brown, the Director for Crisis and Resilience Consulting in the Middle East at Control Risks. Thanks a lot, Will, for joining us on this program. So we'll start the discussion in a moment, but first let's take a look at what does this deal mean for the region and business. September 15th, 2020, and as the pandemic rages around the world, a peace deal is signed in Washington, D.C. For the first time in their history, relationships between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain are normalized. These so-called Abraham Accords were one of President Trump's final pieces of foreign policy.
Today, the world sees that they're choosing cooperation over conflict, friendship over enmity, prosperity over poverty, and hope over despair.
Similar agreements were quickly reached with Morocco and Sudan. But the response from the Palestinians was swiftly seen on the streets of the West Bank as well as on social media. In a tweet, the Palestinian Authority called it a black day in the history of the people of Palestine and wrote that the only way to peace is the end of Israel's occupation. Equally swift has been the flow of money and deals between the countries. This is the Israeli arm of the water technology company Fluence. It specializes in desalination, transportation, and reuse of water. A deal for business in Dubai, a city built in the desert, was one of the first to be signed.
I must say this is the fastest deal I've ever encountered in my professional life. Definitely it makes it much easier now when we have a direct approach and welcome in a Muslim country and a strong country that can be a hub to us.
And this is the hub he's talking about, the port in Dubai, which has opened up markets in Asia and Africa for Israeli goods. But the operator of this port, DP World, is not just transporting goods through here. It's one of the many companies that has invested in Israel. And this is a load of goods from Dubai arriving in the Israeli port of Haifa. Trade isn't just in goods. Deals with football clubs, finance, food technology, and cybersecurity have all been quickly announced. And despite the pandemic, tourism is also increasing. In December alone, 60,000 Israelis visited Dubai. Fleur Hassan Nahom is one of the deputy mayors of Jerusalem and one of the creators of the UAE-Israel Business Council.
Israel and the UAE are possibly the most advanced economies in the Middle East. We have a lot in common, our diversity, our entrepreneurship spirit. And so the minute the peace was announced, I think that people just were jumping to get to know each other. They were so curious about each other. We started creating WhatsApp forums and Zoom meetings, and it kind of just took its own, it really had its own pace and its own momentum.
As the water tech company boss at Fluence says, it's not just about money.
Business can be the path to peace and vice versa. Peace is the path to business. So both as an Israeli and as a businessman, I feel excited and enthusiastic and proud for having our products being the path to the peace there.
Thani, let me begin with you. You were part of this historic deal, one of the first ones signed between the UAE and an Israeli company. So tell us, what was the motivation behind that?
Well, like any other businessman, we always aspire to grow and to find opportunities. Israel was a market that we couldn't tap earlier, and now when we could, and being a member of the UAE Israeli Business Council, I reached out to the council to find me a counterpart in the water industry that, as a group, we're already in, and to filter the companies and to find companies that share with us the values and the vision. And when we found Fluence, and of course, in the beginning we had the stereotype of each other, but then we found out that, to be honest, I don't want to sound very romantic, but it was a match made in heaven. We spoke the same language, we had the same aspiration, and we both wanted to grow. Israel had the technology, they are few laps ahead when it comes to the water industry, and in the UAE, water is an issue, it's scarce, and Israel has solved that issue, so we in the group try to benefit from it. So we reached out to Fluence and we agreed on a memorandum of understanding to bridge this industry and to bring the Fluence products to the United Arab Emirates.
Adedayo, I mean, yes, the deal has formalized relationships between the two countries, but the fact is that both of them were anyways doing business, some sort of business, unofficially. So what's changed with this deal?
Well, for the one thing, it reduces the cost of doing business for Israelis. They can formally enter the UAE without having to set up an umbrella company in the UK or in Singapore. So that just makes it a lot easier for them to enter the UAE market, reduces the logistics and tax costs of setting up a business. It also opens multiple sectors for Israelis to enter in, from tourism to tech to healthcare. So it opens the market. And finally, there's the people-to-people ties as well. This is soft power for both countries, and also for Israelis trying to meet others in the Arab world. This is a very cosmopolitan country, the UAE. And so the soft power dynamic is, I think, a key component of this deal.
Now, Will, Adedayo spoke about how there are going to be a lot of opportunities for Israelis in the UAE. What about the Emiratis? What are the opportunities for them in Israel?
So I think with any of these deals, we'll see business go in both directions. It clearly requires a win-win situation. Unless you have business working in both directions, that's not going to be the case. I mean, we've seen in Dubai, particularly already, since the deal was established, that we've seen that kosher considerations around restaurants, we've seen that food is being imported into our supermarkets from Israel, which is a huge benefit in terms of food miles and air miles and various other things. And from a personal point of view, I've also seen there is now a Krav Maga gym that's opened in the town within weeks of the deal settling. So this is clearly, there are transactions going in both directions already.
Adedayo, I want to come to you. I mean, this is not the first deal between Israel and an Arab country. They've signed deals with Jordan and Egypt, but they weren't that hugely successful in terms of business, at least, and even in terms of achieving what they were set out to. Do you think that there are going to be challenges even for this deal to work, or is this different from the other two?
I think the logic of the deals are quite different. The logic of the deal with the normalization with Egypt was born of trying to end a war. And the logic is sort of similar with Jordan. And there have been political skirmishes that sort of made those deals not successful. This deal is different because the emphasis is really on making sure that people on the ground feel the economic benefits. So from the beginning, the deal is all about trying to get those people-to-people flows, those financial flows going, which is unlike the deals in the past. So while there will be challenges, and those challenges will really relate to different systems of doing business, I don't see the political challenges as being the same.
Thani, you're quite optimistic about this deal, but the fact remains that there is still a section out there, even within the UAE, which still sympathizes with the Palestinian cause, and there is a mistrust between the two communities that's existed for decades historically. Do you think that's going to be a challenge?
Definitely. We were adversaries for a very long time. Even if the United Arab Emirates has not been into war with Israel directly, but definitely there will be reservation. But the UAE has taken a stand that they are supporting the two-state solution, so they have not given up on the Palestinian cause. There are still Palestinian sympathizers that will not be forgotten. Having said that, we will have to weigh the benefits to the reservations. And I think with time, the benefits will outweigh these reservations.
Well, I mean, it's a big deal, definitely, for the UAE and Israel. We have seen more deals being signed. Morocco, Bahrain, all of them have signed up. How does that change the trade and business dynamics in this region?
I think it's clearly going to have quite a significant impact on the dynamics. I mean, I think one of the things that you see is that from the Arab nations' point of view, there are quite a lot of adversarial views of the deal. We're seeing that in a reaction in some of the elements around some of the technology threats that we face in the region. And we're seeing that there has been a spike in some of the cyber attack elements in the UAE since the deal was signed.
We're going to discuss those challenges in more detail later in the program. But Adedayo, as Tani was saying, he's quite optimistic despite the history that the business community will be able to drive this deal ahead. But do you think it's going to be challenging, or do you think that they can bridge the gap much more easily?
I think these are economies, the economies of the Gulf are more economically compatible with Israel. So therefore, there will be some ease in bridging the gap. But at the end of the day, these are very small markets. There's just but so much that can be achieved. And they're markets that have other multinationals that have been here for a long time. So the big challenge will really be showing the value added of an Emirati firm in Israel and an Israeli firm in the UAE.
Tani, the deal has been signed, and you're already seeing, as you mentioned, companies signing deals. Where do you see the challenge in terms of Emirati businesses entering Israel?
See, there was a stereotype that Israeli economy is more of a transactional economy, but the UAE is more of a relationship. But after dealing with a few Israeli companies and signing an MOU myself with an Israeli company, I found out that this is a myth. We are a lot alike, more than we thought. And in the UAE, as Adedayo just mentioned, it's a very cosmopolitan. We have 200 nationals in this country. We have adapted to the 200 nationals. Now it's only 201.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back on Talking Business, we'll find out what does this deal mean for the region, especially given that there's a new administration in the United States. Welcome back to Talking Business. I'm Samir Hashmi in Dubai, and we are discussing what does the peace deal between Israel, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain mean for the region and the world. Tani, let me come to you. Do you expect now more countries in the region feeling confident to sign up this deal?
Sure.
Especially the business communities.
For sure. We ourselves have been approached by some companies in our neighboring countries wanting to reach out to Israeli companies. So I definitely think that more countries in the region will follow.
Adedayo, is it more complicated for countries like Saudi Arabia, even if there is an opportunity in terms of business for them to go ahead because of political reasons?
Well, definitely. I think under the current king, it's impossible because he sort of aligns to the old school of thought, which is you have to solve the Palestinian issue before you can engage with Israel. So I think for the moment, the deal is off the table. But they have a bit of an experiment with Bahrain to see how it goes and how people will react to it.
Now, Will, I want to talk about the challenges, and you specialize in cybersecurity. How big a challenge is that, and how do you see that panning out going ahead?
So there has been a spike since the accord was signed of about 30%, but I think it's important to put that in context. We are also living in a time where remote working has now become the norm. That has done two things. That has meant that organizations have very rapidly deployed new technologies in their environment to enable continuity to take place, and it increases the risk and the threat environment that these employees are working in. So I think it would be an oversimplification to say there's been a huge spike as a result of signing the deal. There's clearly been an impact, but we're also working in a quite an unusual context in terms of the after effects of 2020. But I think as you said, there has been an increase in activity. What organizations need to do about that is really around three legs. They need to make sure they've got the technology in place. Technology is absolutely useless without having effective processes to make sure that that technology stays current and maintained. And the most important element is around making sure that people are aware and that their people don't expose the organization that they're operating in to these attacks and the threats that are coming through.
Thani, is that a worry? Because as Will was saying, that cyber attacks have gone up. Security of people, especially businesses that are involved in doing business with Israel and vice versa. So is that a concern?
Concern, no, because who's a better friend to have than Israel when it comes to cyber technology? But of course, this is a variable that will need to be considered in like we do in our organization, and I'm sure all of the other organizations take care of that. Where Israel can help us a lot in protecting our firewalls by having stronger ones.
Adhidayo, now, Iran, of course, was unhappy with this deal. How does that play out in terms of the region, given that the deal has already been signed? And could we see more threats from that side?
I think definitely we'll see more threats from Iran. What we're seeing is a new economic and security bloc with Morocco now in the deal in Sudan as well. But in the Gulf, I'm not quite sure. One of the challenges with dealing with Iran in the Gulf is that every country has its own view on Iran. So Oman, for example, is quite open to Israel, but still has engagement with Iran, and the same can be said for Qatar. So there is now more at stake for Iran as well, and therefore there'll be more heightened competition.
Now, the other change is that we have a new administration in the United States. How does that change things over here? The deals have been signed, but what about the potential deals that could have been signed? Because a view here is that the Trump administration was able to push a lot of these deals through, and there was support from the business community. How do you see that panning out? Will, you want to take that first?
I think what we anticipate is that there will be a softening on the position with Iran over time. However, that is not going to be something that happens immediately. We're not going to click our fingers and go back to the JCPOA in 2015. And the reasons for that is that some of the sanctions that have been put in place and the regulatory framework is going to take quite a long time to unwind. So very similar to what we expect to see with the US and some of the other nations in the world, there will be a period of time when we start to see a normalization and stabilization, but it's not going back to where we were a few years ago. But we definitely see that starting to work in that direction.
And Adhidayo, do you see more countries signing up or signing deals? Apart from Saudis, we discussed them, yeah.
I can potentially see Oman signing a deal, but there's recently been a change in power, so it will take some time. I think the Omanis would like to see both the benefits of the deals that have already been signed and the trend in popular reaction around the Arab world to these deals.
Now, one thing what we've seen, Thani, is since the deal was announced that the Israelis have softened their position as far as defense deals go. The UAE is procuring F-35 from the United States. Do you see an opportunity for companies in that space, defense?
The defense industry is one of the marvels of Israel. So if any group in the UAE wants to take advantage of the marvels in Israel, defense is definitely one of them.
To sum up, it's just been a few months since this deal was announced, but let's say 2-3 years from now, what do you see the results of this deal, and could we see more countries actually signing up?
I think in 3 years' time, it will be a good time for UAE to mediate peace. I always say negotiating with adversaries is like playing poker, and negotiating with friends, you build a partnership. So with the business communities building partnerships and building and becoming closer to each other, then the UAE will be in a strong position to play the mediator role between Palestine and Israel. The UAE has always taken the stand that they will support the two-state solution, and I think with being friends, Israel will not play poker with the United Arab Emirates. So it will be more of a building partnership with the three parties.
And what in terms of trade and business, where do you see that headed? How big or worth could be the trade or business between the two?
Israel is known to be the startup nation, and I would like to call the UAE, or quote a friend that called the UAE the scale-up nation. For Israel to actually reach every nook and cranny in the world, then there is no better partner than the United Arab Emirates. So I see the business growing, the products that Israel, or the tangible product, the hard products that Israel can or could produce. If they want to reach Christchurch or Buenos Aires, the UAE is the best route. And plus, if they want to develop an app for the Arab world, Dubai is the best place to test it. So, and vice versa. I see a lot of businesses where Israel used to import from Europe and Turkey, and some of these the products are available here, made in the UAE. So I see that benefiting also. So I think 3 years from now, you will have a stronger economy in the United Arab Emirates and a stronger economy in Israel.
Adidaya, you share that view that given all the blitz and the excitement, can the partnership really scale to that level, say 3 to 4 years from now?
I think the partnership will scale in certain sectors, perhaps not in all sectors. High tech definitely is a sector where the UAE's need really meets Israel's expertise, so I can see a lot of scale there. Healthcare, logistics as well, as mentioned, and tourism as well. So I can see scale there. But then there are other sectors that are more mature in both countries that there will be less room for partnership. And overall, these are two small countries. So the impact of these deals 3 years from now will be felt more if we can get even more countries in the Middle East and even perhaps other parts of Africa on board with this deal.
Final word to you, Will. As Adidaya was saying, you need to get more countries. Can these two countries bring more countries together?
I think absolutely. I think if you look at the opportunity presented by the relationship between Israel and the UAE, they are both very small, both relatively young, hugely dynamic nations. We are stronger together. And I think with that kind of context, organizations within those countries are going to want to work more closely with Israel and the UAE. So I absolutely think that's the case.
Well, those are your predictions, but we'll know only in 3 years or 4 years whether the deal has worked or not, and maybe we can come back and discuss this again. Thanks a lot for your time, Dani, Adidaya, and William. And thanks a lot for watching this program, Talking Business here in Dubai. This is Samir Hashmi, signing off.